Hello and welcome to Comparative Vertebrate Anatomy. Today we're going to be focusing on the digestive system. And while we're mostly looking at the human digestive system in this particular conversation, we are going to talk about some differences in other organisms, vertebrates obviously, and then later on we'll actually do a comparison of each of the different kinds of digestive system that you'd find in like herbivores versus omnivores versus carnivores. But today we're going to focus on us. Okay, so the question is, what is digestion? And digestion is the breakdown of large molecules, which if you're consuming this food, into soluble molecules that can be distributed throughout the body. And this is done with several chemicals, digestive juices, and enzymes. And it is absorbed through the walls of the digestive system, and then it goes into your blood where it can be distributed throughout the body. The digestive system is a tube, right, that runs from the mouth to the anus, and this is true for all vertebrate digestive systems. It's responsible for the processing of food, absorption of nutrients, and then of course the elimination of waste, because you can't use everything that you take in. There are some accessory glands that supply the things that are needed to move the food and break it down. But the bulk of the digestive system is actually this tube, and when you look at a nice picture of the digestive system that you see here, you can see it starts at the mouth. You've got some accessory glands here, the salivary glands. Then you just follow that path. You've got the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas. These are the other accessory organs, and we'll talk about them later on. But then you just continue following that path, right, until you finally exit. Okay, so there are four main stages of food processing, and the first one obviously is ingestion. You have to get it into your body. Then digestion occurs, and this is the breakdown. It occurs in two ways. There's mechanical digestion, chemical, and then it's absorbed right through into the cells lining the digestive tract, and then it can be passed through into the bloodstream, and then anything that's undigested is eliminated. So ingestion, digestion, absorption, elimination. And some of these things actually occur simultaneously. Digestion and absorption, and then ingestion and digestion are occurring at the same time as well. So when we start looking at digestion itself, we've got mechanical digestion, and so this is physical. This is like chewing, for instance, or grinding it up with muscular contractions, or chemical digestion, typically hydrolysis, and this is the splitting of the molecules. It's done with enzymes. Okay, so here's your little quiz coming up. So which type of digestion is the following? It's 1, chewing a saltine. That is mechanical. 2, saliva breaking down the saltine. That is chemical. 3, your tongue breaking pieces of a hamburger part. That is mechanical. And 4, pepsin, an enzyme in your stomach, breaking down the protein of the hamburger. That is chemical, right? So you have all of these examples, but digestion starts, as does, ingestion, in the mouth, right? So the mouth ingests the food. The teeth are the gnashers, they're the grinders, they're the cutters, and they will mechanically break down the food. The tongue is actually very important. It acts like a plunger and pushes the food back into the throat, in the pharynx, and this is how it ends up getting into the esophagus, because you swallow once it's in the pharynx. The taste buds are also located on the tongue, and the taste buds kind of tell you what you're eating, right? And so is it sweet, sour, bitter, and then salty, right, are the 4 tastes. Now, the salivary glands are the things that provide the saliva. They're secreting the saliva. And saliva is important for 3 reasons. The one that we think of most is the lubrication of chewed food. I think we've all tried to chew crackers without drinking water, and it turns out to be a hot mess, and it's all dry and gross. So lubrication is really important. It's what allows the food to stick together and to slide back into the throat and then down the esophagus. The other thing that's really important is digestion actually begins here in the oral cavity with saliva, because saliva has salivary amylase in it, and amylase is the enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates. And in the mouth, you actually start with the starches, but carbohydrates are starches and sugars, just as a side note. Now, the other thing that's great about saliva is it contains enzymes, and those enzymes will kill any pathogens or any opportunistic microbes that happen to be in your food. And so it is your first line of food defense, which is kind of exciting. Okay, now, as this food is chewed into a little ball, that ball is called a bolus, and it's pushed back into the pharynx, and this is the back of the throat, and that's where swallowing starts to occur. And there is a very important little flap of tissue called the epiglottis, and the epiglottis will cover the trachea, which is the respiratory system to the lungs, cover the trachea when you're swallowing food, and then when you're breathing, it will cover the esophagus, and so the air goes into your lungs and not into your stomach. So it's very, very important. And we've all swallowed wrong and gotten that mixed up, or we've swallowed air, and neither of those things are pleasant, so the epiglottis is quite important. Now, once it goes into the esophagus, this is just a smooth tube that's made of muscle, and it undulates in contractions, pushing the food down, and this is called peristalsis, right? And so these contractions move the food, but then they also help to continue that mechanical digestion, and then the food eventually reaches the stomach. Now, in the stomach is also muscle, but it's folded. So your stomach, when it's empty, is about the size of your fist, but it's got folds inside, and so kind of like an accordion, it'll stretch out, and you can fill it to, I think it's something like 8 times its actual size. Two things are going on here. You've got mechanical digestion and chemical digestion, and the stomach is contracting to mix the food up and mix it with these gastric juices. And gastric juice has hydrochloric acid, which is what allows the cells to break down. It actually breaks down, dissolves the cell walls and cell membranes, depending on what kind of cell you're talking about. And it also is the second phase of killing harmful or opportunistic bacteria, because the acid it dissolves all cell membranes, and so that's going to affect bacteria too. Now, the hydrochloric acid denatures proteins, which allows them to be broken down into their amino acids by the enzyme pepsin, which is located in the gastric juice as well. It would seem that having hydrochloric acid in your stomach, that is a bad idea. However, your stomach lining is protected by this really thick mucus, and so that keeps it from actually dissolving the cell walls. And your epithelial cells inside of your stomach are not recycled, but they're replaced on a very regular basis, okay? And so you've got this nice protection from this really acidic, this strong acid. The end of the stomach, right, there are 2 sphincters. There's one at the top, the cardiac sphincter, and then you have the pyloric sphincter, which is at the bottom of the stomach. So the cardiac sphincter is going to be up here, and so food will pass through this little muscular ring, and then here it'll pass through the muscular ring when it's ready to go into the small intestine. And so these are both involuntary. You don't have any control over those. Okay, so sometimes there are lesions that will occur in this wall. The mucus is too thin, or there's an irritant, or something happens, and you get ulcers. And ulcers can be very problematic because those acids will begin to burn and kill the cells that actually make up the stomach lining, and so they can eventually lead to bleeding, internal bleeding, which can be bad. The lesions most of the time are caused by a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. There's also viruses that cause lesions, but you can treat these, and that's great. Well, you can't treat a virus, but you can treat the ulcers. You can treat the bacterial ulcers with antibiotics and things like that, so that's exciting. But some other things will up your risk for ulcers, and that's tobacco, alcohol, caffeine, aspirin, and sadly, chocolate. Okay, now we've moved into the small intestine after we leave the stomach, and in the small intestine you have digestion and absorption going on, whereas in the stomach it was just digestion. So you have some absorption in other parts of the digestive tract, but most of it is going to be happening in the small intestine. And this is over 18 feet long, 6 meters, and it's about 600 meters square in surface area. Now, most of the digestion is going to occur in the first part of that, right? And so here, if you look at the stomach, you've got the duodenum right here, and then that is going to move into the jejunum, which is the next part of the small intestine, and then the ileum is the last part of the small intestine, which moves into the large intestine or colon. And so the duodenum is where you're going to be having most of the digestion in the small intestine occurring. And this is, of course, again through enzymatic hydrolysis. And then the absorption is going to be occurring in the rest of the small intestine. Lots and lots of absorption. Now, when you talk about digestion in the small intestine, you're really digesting everything. And so proteins, we started the protein digestion in the stomach, and we started the carbohydrate digestion in the mouth with the saliva, but you're going to be digesting everything here. And so trypsin and chymotrypsin are both in the small intestine that are continuing to break down those proteins. And so that's in contrast to the pepsin that was in the stomach. And then lipids, there's lipase and bile salts, and bile salts are going to basically coagulate or emulsify the fats, and then the lipase is actually going to break them down. And then pancreatic amylase will continue digesting any starch that hasn't been, and also sugars. And these come in kind of a mix. It's called pancreatin, and it's released from the pancreas. So when you see pancreatin, it's actually a mix of a lot of these things. Okay, now this folding that occurs inside the small intestine is what allows an increase in surface area, and you need surface area to absorb anything. Actually, lots of surface area means more absorption. And so you have the tube itself, and then there's some interior folds in the lumen. The lumen is the opening. And then there are villi, which are these little protrusions, little folds there. And then these folds have folds on them called microvilli. And so you actually have this kind of four level of folding action going on. Okay, now increased surface area, I just said, was really important, and actually you find it a lot in your large complex animals, and that would be the vertebrates that we're talking about. Lungs have extra surface area, the small intestine has extra surface area, kidney has extra tubules to get lots of surface area, and then of course your blood vessels, you have about 100,000 kilometers of blood vessels in your body, and that's because you also need the surface area for gas exchange and nutrient absorption into the cells surrounding the blood vessels. Just a side note, I like this one. The small intestine, to put that 600 meters squared in perspective, is about the surface area of a tennis court, and it is all folded up inside you. Remember, nature is super efficient, and that's pretty exciting. Okay, now after we leave the small intestine, we're going to move into the large intestine, which is also called the colon, and it's connected to the small intestine at this little T-junction, right? And so the large intestine. The small intestine comes in right about here, and then you have the food moving up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, through the sigmoid colon, and then out the rectum. Now, you're absorbing nutrients here, but the main function of the large intestine is to squeeze out the last remaining water from whatever is the waste product, okay? And you can actually have a really good example of the large intestine absorbing lots of water when it fails, right? So if you get inflammation in your colon, your large intestine, you can't absorb as much water, and that's what diarrhea is, right? Is that inflammation of the large intestine. But together, the small intestine and the large intestine absorb about 90% of the incoming water. Okay, now the large intestine is a farm. It's a zoo, if you will, of all kinds of bacteria. Some are commensal, some are mutualistic, but they live on the undigested or unabsorbed materials. And this is very important. They get food, but what we get are the vitamins, because the byproduct of their consumption, which is chemosynthesis of their stuff, is these vitamins, and so we get most of our vitamins as a byproduct of these bacteria. Now, sometimes there are gases that are produced as a byproduct of this metabolism, and that is what flatulence is, and so you can blame your little bacteria for that. But if you want to see what's in you, there are some bacteria in other places, a lot in your mouth, right? A little bit in your small intestine, but when you start looking at bacteria, these are the big guys. And you can actually see some names that you've probably heard before. Lactobacilli, these are like milk, related to milk, and these are considered part of the probiotics. And actually all of these are probiotics, but you'll see lactobacilli in all your probiotic products that you buy. Streptococcus and Staphylococcus, those can both cause infections, right? Strep throat and all that good stuff, staph infection. You have them all over you. They're on your skin, they're in your nasal passages, they're in your gut, and these guys actually protect you, but if you are not doing well, if you are compromised in some way, health-wise, they can also become opportunistic and can actually make you sick. But anyway, so there's a list of some of the things that you see. Oh, and entero, when you see that, remember we were talking about different terms mean different parts of the body, like hepatic is liver, things like that. Entero is gut. Okay, now the final section is the rectum, and this is where you're going to have your fecal. There's lots and lots of bacteria because this is where the fecal matter is. This is where the last part of the water is absorbed, and it's also the storage place. It's the storage house for feces, and then feces is eliminated through the anus, and the anus is a voluntary sphincter, and then you have an involuntary sphincter as well, and so you have mostly complete control over defecation, but it's not entirely. I mean, it can go badly if the involuntary sphincter does its thing without you participating in that. Okay, now the dead end of that T down here. So here's the ileum coming in. This is the cecum. And the cecum in us is not particularly useful, but in herbivores, you're going to find that the cecum is huge, and it's important in herbivores for digesting the cellulose and that you find in grasses and leaves and things like that. So for us, it's small and it's relatively functionless. Here's my fun animation. Okay, now you have a lot of blood that's going to need to go to and go away from the digestive system, and so the small intestines, the large intestine, and so what you have is this hepatic portal system, and nutrients will actually go back to the liver through this hepatic portal vein, and they'll be processed there, and then from the liver, which is highly vascularized, it'll go to be distributed. It goes up through the heart to be distributed through the rest of the body, but the liver is that final processing place. So it's absorbed into the hepatic portal system and specifically the hepatic portal vein, and will go back up through the liver. Okay, when you start looking at the digestive system overall, you can see that it's going through that nice big tube. There's chemical, there's mechanical, a little bit of storage until you eliminate. Okay. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but off of the cecum, there's this little teeny thing, and this is the appendix. Okay, and the appendix is a vestigial organ, right? And a vestigial organ means that it used to be more important in another species that we evolved from. And so in other animals, the appendix actually does things. In us, we think that it has some contribution to immune function, but we can actually do without. And so when it gets infected, when you get appendicitis, you can remove it, and it's not a big deal. It may actually function to help repopulate the intestines with the beneficial bacteria after some sort of event like an infection, or you've taken antibiotics or something like that. Okay, now what about the accessory organs? You have to produce all of these fluids and enzymes and stuff like that. So the pancreas is the first one we want to talk about. It's actually right here underneath the stomach. It's very exciting. Here's the liver, here's the gallbladder, so there are those three. The pancreas produces the pancreatic juices that we talked about before, the pancreatin, stuff like that. But it also produces sodium bicarbonate that's important to neutralize the hydrochloric acid, because the hydrochloric acid the stomach is the only thing that's protected from that. The esophagus isn't, heartburn, and the small intestine isn't. And so you have to neutralize it here before it moves on into the small intestine. Okay, the liver. This is actually your largest internal organ, and it does lots and lots of things. But in relation to the digestive system, it makes the bile. Okay, so you've got the pancreatic juices, the pancreatin, and then you also have bile, which is coming from the liver. Okay, and then the gallbladder is just like a little storage sac, and it holds the bile with the bile salts in it, and then it pushes the bile into the small intestine. Okay, so here's just another list of the enzymes. The ones that are in bold are things that you really, really want to understand because they're going to come up again later on. Okay, and then here is just a nice breakdown of what's going on where. I didn't actually mention the nucleic acid digestion, but it's really important too because you have to rebuild your DNA, RNA, and all that good stuff, so you need the nucleotides from that. And so this is also on this chart. Be familiar with where everything is happening. Okay, then here's just the picture overall. So the liver would be up here. Right? And then you have these hepatic ducts which carry all of the digestive juices. There's the pancreas with the pancreatic duct, and then the cystic duct comes from the gallbladder. Okay, so how do we regulate digestion? Well, it's all about hormones. Different hormones will trigger or inhibit, stimulate or inhibit different parts of the digestive system. And here's just an overall. You don't actually need to know any of these, but gastrin, secretin, and CCK are going to be the big hormones that are actually working specifically in the digestive system. There's another hormone that we're going to talk about in just a minute that's important as well. Okay, so nutritional requirements. All organisms have to get their carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur in addition to their minerals and vitamins and stuff. And these are going to come from the food that they eat, right? Sometimes the diet has to supply these macromolecules already pre-assembled. We can't make them. If we can't make it, it's called an essential nutrient. Everything else is just a micro or macronutrient. Macronutrients are things we need a lot of. Micronutrients are things we only need a little bit of. Okay, so essential fatty acids, we can actually synthesize most of our fatty acids, but there are some of them, certain unsaturated fatty acids are the things we need. It's very rare that somebody actually has a deficiency in fatty acids. This really only happens if you are having a no-fat diet or you're not eating things that have the appropriate types of fat. Okay, amino acids, these are your builders of protein. Okay, and there are 20 amino acids. We can synthesize 12 of them, but we need the other 8 to come from our diet. And so these are essential amino acids. They come pre-assembled. And if you have an insufficient amount of these amino acids, you will have a form of malnutrition that's called protein deficiency. Okay, and then if you are someone who is a vegetarian or a vegan, you have to make sure that you're actually getting all of the essential amino acids that you need. And these are the essential amino acids. These are things we don't produce that we have to eat. And you can see that if you're just eating vegetables, right, you're not going to get everything you need. You're not going to get the tryptophan and the lysine, but you can compensate with beans, for instance, and some other things to get those to get that full spectrum. Okay, so vitamins, these are just things that you need in small amount. There are about 13 vitamins that we know are absolutely essential. They're divided into 2 categories, fat-soluble and water-soluble, and they go to different places depending. And then there are minerals, and these are the inorganic nutrients that we are required. These are both micronutrients, by the way, vitamins and minerals. Now, herbivorous animals, these grazers, these vegetarian animals, may actually have mineral deficiencies if they are grazing on plants that live in mineral-poor soil. And what you're actually looking at here is this lovely caribou who is eating a horn, right? And so it's doing this to get the minerals that it needs because this soil here in the region that these guys live has not the minerals that they need. It's very deficient in the important minerals. Okay, so each type of food presents a problem, and we'll come back to this later on, but you can see adaptations to the different foods really in 2 places. 1, the teeth of the animal, and 2, the digestive tract itself. right? And so that's going to include the juices, the bacteria, things like that. But the structure of the digestive system is going to be radically different. And here's just a preview of what we'll talk about later on. You can see that this vegetarian animal, the horse, has a huge cecum and a huge large intestine, okay? And that is because it's going to have to break down all that cellulose that it's eating in grass. And again, we'll come back to this later on. Okay. So more or less food, well, both of those are bad. Undernourishment is when you have a deficiency in caloric intake, in calories, and this is really detrimental. It causes stunting and is really bad. Malnourishment is where you're missing an essential nutrient. And this is actually much more common than undernutrition. If you're eating a diet of just rice, for instance, you may not be undernourished, but you'll definitely be malnourished. And then, of course, overnourishment is bad, and that's excessive food intake. And this is where you store fat, your excess calories as fat, and that has health problems too. So how do you know how much to eat? There are hunger centers in the brain that actually regulate your food intake, and a lot of this is stimulated by your blood sugar level, right? The blood glucose level, and that's why you get hungry and why you stop being hungry. Okay, and glucose regulation is the thing that we're going to focus on. It is another example of homeostasis. As glucose levels rise in the body, the pancreas is going to produce insulin, and as we know, the inability to produce insulin or the inability of insulin to bind to its receptors, that is diabetes mellitus. And insulin is what allows glucose to be taken up into the body cells, and it'll stimulate the storage of glucose in a unit that's made up of these glucose subunits called glycogen, and that's what lowers the blood glucose level. And so insulin is responsible for the transport of glucose, the storage of glucose as glycogen, and then the lowering of blood glucose levels. When those levels get too low, then glucagon is secreted from the pancreas, and this promotes the breakdown of that glycogen, that glucose storage molecule, and then glucose is released back into the blood, and now your levels will rise. So you can lower them with insulin, you can raise them with glucagon. Okay, now sometimes there is another issue that goes with the regulation of food intake. And so what you have is leptin is a really, really important signaling protein that will decide whether you're hungry or not. And so everybody produces leptin, and they've done some experiments on mice, and those that inherit a defect in this gene, it's actually the OB gene that encodes for leptin, will become very obese. Now, in overall cases of obesity, most cases of obesity are caused by diet and lack of exercise, but sometimes it is a genetic thing, and when it is a genetic thing, often it relates to this production of leptin. And leptin signals fullness and increased fat burning by traveling to the hypothalamus, where it's going to inhibit the secretion of something called a neurotransmitter called neuropeptide Y, and neuropeptide Y increases appetite. So when you inhibit that, you will not be hungry. It's going to suppress your appetite. Now, it also, this leptin, increases the production of noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine, and this stimulates fat breakdown. As a side note, insulin also does this. Insulin also inhibits neuropeptide Y. So if you can't produce leptin, or if you can't produce insulin, then you have a tendency to overeat. Here are the mice from the study, and you can see this one is the leptin deficient mouse, and this one is the normal mouse. So I will leave you with these little mice, and if you have any questions about any of this, please ask next time I see you in class, and thanks for listening.